Bene, direi che adesso è arrivato il momento di proseguire con un keynote che ci porterà sotto i fondali marini per cercare di capire che direzione sta prendendo ehm, diciamo, l'internet subacqueo. Quindi direi di invitare qui sul palco, vediamo se è pronto da qualche parte, ma lo scopriremo subito, Mike Hollands, CEO di Vela Infrastructure. Un applauso, chissà dov'è? L'abbiamo perso. Dove abbiamo... Ah, eccolo qua, here you are. I was looking for you and I didn't find you. Hi, nice to meet you. So, the stage is all yours and thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can someone just give me an indication that they can hear me okay? Great, excellent.
Salve.
It's great to be here to share some
Possiamo
thoughts with you about subsea connectivity in the Mediterranean. My name is Mike Hollands, and I lead a company, a newly formed company called Vela Infrastructure, whose focus is on developing subsea cable landing stations and interconnection data centers where subsea cables land. Prior to my role, I worked for 10 years at Interaction, which then became Digital Realty, and I spent a great deal of my time at that company developing Marseille as a subsea cable connectivity hub. Marseille's a great case study on which to describe how I think things are going to evolve in the Mediterranean. When Interaction got involved with Marseille, it was back in 2014. And Marseille already had several cables that landed at the city, but its role was a strategic transit site. By that I mean, if you walked around the data center in Marseille at that time, all the equipment you would have seen was transport equipment. There was no IP, there was no interconnection. All the traffic landed in Marseille and went straight on up to Paris, to Frankfurt, to London, and that's where all the interesting interconnection activity happened. So that was the situation in 2014. What really transformed the situation was the arrival of new cables with much higher capacity on those cables. And with so much capacity landing, it was no longer economical or efficient to transport all that data up to other locations. And so Marseille began to evolve and to transform. It needed help. It needed data center capacity. And that's the part of the equation that Interaction and Digital Realty played. So when we arrived, there was less than 2 megawatts of data center capacity in the city. And it was all pretty unutilized. Today, there's 5 data centers and 70 megawatts of capacity. So for a truly economic interconnection hub to develop, you needed the increase in subsea cables, but you needed increase in data center capacity as well. And what did we see happen? We saw many content and cloud nodes, caching nodes, content nodes deploy in Marseille. We saw the number of networks in Marseille shoot up exponentially. When I left, there was 250 networks interconnecting with those subsea cables in Marseille. That drove a huge number of increased cross-connects and internet exchange capacity also transformed. So by 2025, Marseille was a very different location, type of location, to what it was in 2014. And Marseille, it's my proposition, is not unique. And what we saw in Marseille is going to start happening elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Let's look at some of the reasons why I make this statement. If we go back in time and look at the number of cables that have been developed throughout the decades, there's nothing hugely remarkable about the 2020s in terms of the numbers of cables. So we went from 21 cables deployed in the Mediterranean, new cables deployed in the 1990s, and in the 2020s, we're going to see nearly 30 cables deployed. But what is truly remarkable is the bar charts on this slide that represent the potential capacity in traffic that's available on those systems. You saw this growing in the early 2000s, in the 2010s. But if you look at the capacity that's already been delivered so far in the 2020s, and we're only halfway through them, it's already 3 times what was delivered in the 3 decades previously added together. And there's still more cables that are going to be deployed in the next 5 years, cables that are well on the way to progression. And by the time they're all in place, the 2020s will have seen a 10 times increase compared to all the 3 decades before. And it's this huge growth in capacity that cannot afford to just go to one location, one hub like Marseille. It's going to look for diverse locations, for increased resilience and better latency. A key factor that will make sure that this works for the Mediterranean is that the types of cables that are being developed in the Mediterranean. This chart puts cables into 3 categories. The intercontinental cables, cables that come from Asia, Middle East, Africa, and come into the Mediterranean to then connect on to the rest of Europe. Then there's regional cables, which connect countries within the Mediterranean itself, from Spain to France and Italy, for example. And then there's national cables as well. The point I want to emphasize is that as we increase in the 20s with the number of cables, so is the increase in intercontinental cables that are taking place. This is important because they're all coming from locations that are booming in terms of content production and content consumption. And that means that these cables aren't just going to be underutilized. This is going to be true traffic coming through them every day, every week. The other aspect about the types of cables that are being deployed is that there is a strong number of regional cables playing a very innovative and creative role. If you look at the cables such as Ionian that have been established by Islelink, Medloop that's been established by Cipartec, more recently Uniterreno established by Unidata, go and visit their websites and you will see some extremely innovative and interesting designs, strategic thought about the connection, the locations they connect, but ensuring that they have many fiber pairs on their system and a huge amount of capacity. Without this innovation, without this strategic thinking about the locations to connect, you would not be able to deliver what I think the Mediterranean needs and is going to become. We should also take note that still to come are some very interesting new cables. So in terms of planned new cables, we have Medusa being developed by Afrix that is going to be connecting 13 different countries in the Mediterranean alone. We have Green Med that Sparkle are developing that is now going to open up the Adriatic to high-speed connectivity in ways that we haven't done for many, many years, and open up the North Adriatic to become part of the Mediterranean hub. And the number of those intercontinental cables, I repeat again, that are still to come in this decade that are going to drive huge amounts of traffic. You remember what happened in Marseille? I'm telling everybody, get ready, because this is going to happen in many other locations in the Mediterranean now. I listed some of the very interesting and important cables that are happening in the Mediterranean. Ionian, Medloop, Unitorreno, Green Med, Medusa. They all have one thing in common. They are not hyperscalers. If you look at what's happening in other parts of the world, like the cables being built in the transatlantic and the Trans-Pacific, the hyperscalers are dominating the development of those cables. So in gray, this chart indicates hyperscalers, and you can see how transatlantic and Trans-Pacific, you're talking about nearly 3/4 to 80% of the capacity that's being delivered in those locations being done by hyperscalers. In the Mediterranean, it's not the case. Hyperscalers are playing a part in some of the intercontinental cables especially, but the real heroes are the telecommunications companies and the alternative developers that I've mentioned that are building important strategic connections, which, when they all come together, create a Mediterranean mesh fit for handling the huge volumes of traffic that consumers are now generating and consuming. But we have a few challenges. Geopolitical issues have caused delays to some key cables. Issues in the Red Sea mean that the IEX system connecting India to Europe is ready everywhere except in the Red Sea, so it cannot be finalized. To Africa is another cable that still has not been completed because of the Red Sea, and Blue Raman, another example. So 3 huge intercontinental cables that are not yet activated because of geopolitical issues, and this means that backhaul routes that have been put in place, ready for that cable's traffic, data center capacity that's waiting with equipment to be switched on and activated, all hasn't happened, hasn't driven cross connects. So these geopolitical issues have caused a bit of a break in the 2020s. Permitting still causes a problem on the regulatory side, delaying increasing the time it takes for cables to come to fruition. And market intervention can also cause problems. Sometimes it's very well, government market intervention is what I mean. Sometimes it's very well intentioned, like the European, CEF funding from the European Commission for subsea cables is helping certain projects get off the ground, but it does distort the market, and sometimes very innovative projects that don't qualify for the funding find it very hard to get off the ground when they're competing with less exciting projects that have got the funding. So there are some challenges, but there are also things that are being done by the digital infrastructure community that are helping solve the problem, solve many problems. Backhaul providers are investing heavily in the connection of cable landing stations to data centers. We still have parts of the Mediterranean that need further investment, southern Italy, northern Greece. But backhaul is really playing its part, backhaul investment. And when, hollow core fiber comes along and further increases latency on backhaul networks, I think that's going to be a real catalyst for subsea development. Data centers are being built in all the key markets. We see huge investments in Athens, in Milan, in Rome. Players like Equinix, Digital Realty, Data4 are all playing a huge part. New entrants like Mediterra and Quadrivium, are building data center capacity and ensuring that the ambition of the subsea cables is matched by what data center operators are doing. Companies like mine, Vela Infrastructure, are developing carrier-neutral cable landing stations to complement the great work that already being done by telecommunications providers in places like Savona and Marseille. And one area that we are spending a lot of time on is developing new locations for subsea cables to land, what I'm calling landfalls. Doing a lot of research to demonstrate and find locations that can serve as diverse and resilient spots for the new cables of the future. So, if we were to look back in the past, this diagram of the Mediterranean would actually capture 70 to 80% of the actual traffic flows in the Mediterranean. I know that there was always other connections, but in terms of volumes of traffic that drove that data center development, that drove those cross-connects, it was quite a limited scope. But that is the past. And the future is very different. It's a Mediterranean mesh, interconnected, where many locations have to play their part as part of the equation. Hubs are going to develop in many locations. They're going to be interconnected. They're going to provide diversity. They're going to provide resilience. In the future, no one is going to talk about one particular location being the new hub or the past hub. In the future, people are going to talk about the Mediterranean being a great local area network served by all the players in the digital ecosystem. Thank you very much.